time to go from an idea to actually revenue is much longer, and the amount of burn that has to be funded is much greater, and the returns have to be that much, the exits have to be that much higher to produce the same level of return. And so that's a real challenge, I think, for the more capital-intensive parts of the technology startup world, how those industries can transform themselves to become more capital efficient the way that the information technology business has in the past decade. And I don't even know if it's possible, because of things like the clinical trial period. So that's a dark cloud, if you will, that I think people should focus on a little bit. And I think if people could innovate in and around those areas, the payoffs could be pretty large if people could figure out how to make those kinds of efforts a little bit more capital efficient. So in terms of areas that I think are interesting to focus on, in terms of new things to look at in terms of starting companies, or in terms of investing in companies, if that's the kind of thing you want to do, I think at least at Union Square Ventures, we have come to believe that we're witnessing in our lifetimes, we're witnessing sort of the waning of the industrial era and the real development of the information era. And one of the things that's happening is that the way the architectures of the way markets and businesses work are changing because of information technology and the way that information can flow from business to business and even inside companies. And what we like to talk about is the fading of the hierarchical model of organization of companies and markets, and the growth of the network model, and the efficiencies that can be gained by a network architecture as opposed to a hierarchical architecture. And you see that play out, in the past decade on the internet, in areas like media, where intermediaries are being replaced by systems that connect buyers and sellers directly. Classified advertising is a really good example of that. What Craigslist did to the classified advertising business in the newspaper industry is a good example of how a network model connecting buyers and sellers directly replaced a hierarchical model, where you picked up the phone, you called somebody in a call center, they placed an ad, the ad got printed, put in a newspaper, put on a truck, and delivered at someone's door. And so a better model emerged, a more efficient model, and it was created a lot of havoc in a traditional industry and created a lot of opportunity in a new industry. I think you're also seeing that in the entertainment business and broadly throughout the media industry. Things like Google coming in and inventing whole new ways of advertising that never existed 10 years, that didn't even exist 15 years ago. And we think that those things will happen again and again and again, and we're looking at verticals that still to this day haven't really been impacted as heavily as the media business. In verticals that we're focused on are areas like financial services, education, and we're starting to noodle around healthcare a fair bit. We haven't made any investments there, and there's probably energy. Would probably be another one that all we think are ripe for some of the similar kinds of innovations that have happened in the media industry over the past decade. And so, it's easy to get caught up in. When you're sitting here in 2012 and you have companies like Facebook going public, and people are talking about that, and everybody is kind of obsessed over that, I think you have to remember that Facebook got started in 8 years ago-ish, and that starting a company that looks a lot like Facebook today isn't necessarily the right thing to do. It was clearly the right thing to do 8 years ago. Probably was even the right thing to do 4 years ago, but may not be the right thing to do about not the right thing to do today. And so we force ourselves to, in our firm, to think not necessarily about what's hot today, but what the world is going to look like a decade from now, and what has to change to get there, and then that leads us to new kinds of investments. And so I would encourage all of you to try to think that way too, in terms of the kinds of things that you want to get involved in your next career moves as they come before you in the next year or two. So I think that's sort of my thoughts in terms of the state of where things are, and since we have about a half an hour left, I'll open up for questions. Got the whole front row here. I'll start with you, Adler.
Okay, so you had a blog post last year about healthcare, where you talked a little bit about education and how you did some research about that industry and developing a thesis before you started investing.
Right.
You mentioned that you're doing the same thing for healthcare, and you just mentioned it again. Can you talk a little bit more about where you see that industry going, consumer-facing healthcare, mobile health? Can you talk about sort of where you see your firm going in terms of investment, and as well as where you see the industry going as a whole?
So I think it's a little early to talk about what we're going to invest in, because we're still trying to figure out how we would want to invest in the healthcare industry. But one thing that has been consistent in terms of the way we've tried to invest is, instead of investing in software and services that makes the existing establishments and institutions in an industry, instead of investing in services that they would deploy to make their businesses better, we have tended to want to compete with those businesses. So when we went into the education industry, we looked at areas like homeschooling and continuing education, which were more entrepreneurial and less controlled by large institutions like the K through 12 public school system or the university system. And we looked at ways to invest in education that would get adopted by new models for education as opposed to the traditional models for education. So I think the same is probably going to be true for us in healthcare. I think wellness is potentially an area that could be interesting, because there isn't an existing, well, there are lots of businesses that service kind of wellness as a category, but the idea of keeping yourself well as opposed to what happens when you get sick is potentially an area that keeps you out of the existing medical system today. I mean, the problem with the medical system today is that you get caught up in an industry that has lots of gatekeepers in the way of the whole insurance and payer system, in terms of the way that hospitals are organized, and all of these very large kind of entrenched interests. And so what we would look for areas to invest that would be outside of that. And there are some other areas that are interesting. I mean, insurance in and of itself could potentially be interesting, right? And a number of people have already tried insurance, so I'm not suggesting that we're going to go back an insurance company, but it certainly feels to me as a consumer of healthcare insurance that I'm buying a product that I don't understand very well, that's very expensive, that isn't very adaptive to people's needs, and that maybe there's an opportunity to do something innovative there. But that's pretty speculative. Any other questions? In the back?
So there's a small group of us here that have been researching the mobile payment space. And they actually, like 3 or 4 months ago, kind of a hot list that we put on Google Alerts, and Dwala was on our list.
Right.
And recently, 2 weeks ago, we saw that you guys made an investment in them. The reason why we put them on the hot list was their idea around how to sidestep interchange fees. So I'm wondering, outside of just Dwala, what your kind of investment thesis is in mobile payments, and then, where does Dwala play in this space and solving a big thing.
So my partner Albert wrote a blog post about Dwala that I thought, did a pretty good job of touching on what our thesis is there. Our view is that money is just information. It's certainly in the electronic world, money is just information. And for me to want to take $20 out of my bank account and send it to you so that you could put it in your bank account, that's just some bits on a wire being transferred. And it makes no sense why that costs 3.5% of the transaction, right? So the thing that we liked about Dwala is that the founders, that's exactly the problem they're trying to solve. They're trying to make money transfer free. And then you would ask the question, well, if they're going to try to make money transfer free, how are they going to make money? And the really big idea there, which we got sucked into, we'll see if it actually can be realized in the form of a business, is that if you made money transfer free, and you had a system that really worked well, that merchants would adopt it and consumers would adopt it, and you'd have a lot of people using your system to transfer money instead of some of the traditional systems like credit cards and other things. And then if you could get millions of people and millions of businesses on a system where the money transfer is free, there's a bunch of value-added services that you could provide on top of that you could turn into a business opportunity. And Dwala's already doing that. So they have a instant loan product that they call Instant, Dwala Instant. So if you have Dwala on your phone and you want to instantly borrow $100, you can instantly borrow $100 from any number of third-party banks who are on the platform, and then you have $100 in your account that you can go spend. And they charge a fee for that. It's a value-added service. You don't have to borrow money to use Dwala, and lots of people might use Dwala for free and never borrow any money, but for those who do, they're making money. And their idea is that there's any number of value-added services they could provide on top of a free payment network. So that's the big idea that we really liked. Was it was something that was just changing the game, just a radically different business model for payments that reflected an essential truism about payments, which is that why should there be any costs to moving bits on a wire?
I'm kind of interested, or I'm really interested in the kind of the future of work and like the rise of freelancers and the destruction of the labor contract and where that creates entrepreneurial opportunities. And you see some companies like Work Market trying to kind of approach that space.
Right.
So I'm curious your perspective on like the future of work and how it will change, going forward, and where opportunities may lie in that.
So if you go back to that point that I was making a little earlier about sort of the hierarchical model that existed in the industrial age and the network model that's starting to emerge in the information age, there's a great paper that was written many years ago by, I think he was an economist, although I could be wrong about whose last name was Coase, C-O-A-S-E, and I forget his first name. And the paper was about why firms exist, the economic conditions that would lead to the notion of a firm. And his point was that people need to be assembled into companies, organizations, firms, because of the transaction costs around doing business. But in a world where the transaction costs are radically lower or possibly non-existent, the notion that people have to be basically assembled into firms starts to, if you follow his logic that he laid out in that paper, the notion that people have to be assembled into firms starts to go away. And you see that already happening. There's lots of people who are freelancers more and more every day. And if through lots of these work marketplaces, it's possible to make a living off the talents that you have without ever having to go to work for somebody else, and without, frankly, having to start your own company. And so Work Market, which is one of our portfolio companies, operates a work market in IT services. So they will, over time, move into other verticals, but the only vertical they're in today is helping companies that need somebody